Hello, everyone. My name is Melanie Richter-Montpetit. I'm the director of the Center for Advanced International Theory, short CAIT, here at the University of Sussex. I would like to welcome you to today's lecture by Dr. Ntina Tzouvala from the Australian National University College of Law. Dr. Tzouvala will present material from her most recent book titled Capitalism, a Civilisation, A History of International Law. The book explores the historical role of international law and its protean concept of the standard of civilization in facilitating global capitalist expansion. The monograph was awarded an honourable mention for our center's book award this year, the Sussex International Theory Prize. The committee noted that the book is, and I quote, methodologically and theoretically innovative and succeeds in reconciling materialist analysis and deconstruction, elegantly weaving together rich insights from third world, Black, indigenous, feminist, and queer Marxisms. Many congratulations, Dr. Tzouvala. I would like to thank the Department of Law and the Center for Global Political Economy for co-sponsoring the event. My special thank you goes to Eve Wilcox, who has done much of the work in getting us together this afternoon. A few words of housekeeping. This event will be recorded and published online, including on our center's YouTube channel. Dr. Tzouvala will speak for around 40 minutes, and then we have a good 45 minutes for questions and conversation. I'm now going to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Tzouvala joined the ANU College of Law as a senior lecturer in July 2020. Prior to this appointment, she was an ARC laureate postdoctoral fellow at Melbourne Law School. She obtained her PhD from Durham Law School in the UK in 2016, where she also worked as a lecturer. Dr. Tzouvala's work focuses on the political economy, history, and theory of international law. She's especially interested in historical materialism, deconstruction, feminist, and queer legal theory. Her first monograph, Capitalism, a Civilisation, A History of International Law, was published by Cambridge University Press in late 2020. Her work has also appeared in leading journals. Among her most recent articles are The Spectre of Eurocentrism in International Legal History, published in the Yale Journal of Law and the Humanities, Deploying Race in the Defense of Humanity, the 2011 intervention in Libya, and African Mercenaries, published in the UCLA Law Review. This piece was co-authored with Catherine Fuller. And A False Promise, Regulating Land Grabbing and the Post-Colonial State, published in the Leiden Journal of International Law. Between 2019 and 2021, Dr. Tzouvala was a founding member of the editorial collective of the Third World Approaches to International Law Review. In early 2020, she was appointed senior advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. Dina, over to you.
Thank you very much for this exceedingly kind introduction. It makes my achievements sound much more plentiful than they actually are. And of course, thank you so much for this very kind invitation. It is great to be in such good company of a university that has such a long and honored tradition of critical approaches to law, critical approaches to international relations, to development, and so on and so forth. So I'm really delighted to be here. And of course, I'm really, really honored by the honorable mention and by the fact that it looks like the book resonates a little bit beyond the very narrow disciplinary confines of our discipline, because I'm a trained lawyer. I haven't been trained in any other discipline. And sometimes, you know, it's really easy to forget how to talk to other humans. So thank you very much, Melanie, for giving me this lovely opportunity to talk to other humans, and thanks to everyone for attending. Before I get started, I also want to acknowledge that I'm currently in Canberra, and that Canberra is the country of the Nahuatl and Gambri people, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, as well as to acknowledge that sovereignty over these lands has never been lawfully ceded. And on this point, I will actually segue to talking about the book. And the book is meant to be primarily an intervention in international law, but hopefully I think it will have, and we will have grounds to discuss perhaps some of its ramifications for international relations or international political economy. So just to give everyone a little bit of a common background to work with, the standard of civilization in international law is generally understood as an important but parochial standard. So the idea is that late 19th and early 20th century international law was at least partially organized along a tripartite distinction. So political communities in most international legal writings were divided in three groups: civilized, so-called semi-civilized, and uncivilized. And as you can imagine, this reflected a typology that I think most people could guess, which is at the top of the pyramid of civilized states were Western Christian majority, white majority states, including, of course, European states, white settler states, including, of course, Australia, the United States, Canada, and debatable to what extent, for example, Latin American states fell within this category. Somewhere in the middle, we found especially empires of the continent of Asia, so the Ottoman Empire, China, Japan, what was called Siam, now Thailand, and Persia, which were acknowledged to possess a certain degree of international legal personality. So to be blunt, they had enough personality to sign unequal treaties. They had enough personality to sign away core rights, including, for example, the level of tariffs or exemptions of foreign nationals from local jurisdiction. And at the bottom of this hierarchy, one found so-called uncivilized states that only enjoyed those rights fit for humanity, so basic humanitarian treatment without any political rights. And in this category belonged the vast majority of political communities in Africa, as well as, of course, indigenous communities all around the world. And if you open an international law textbook, if civilization is mentioned at all, and very often it is not, but if it is mentioned at all, the idea is that, you know, this was an explicitly, of course, racist and Western provincialist standard. And after 1945, with the promulgation of the UN Charter and subsequently with the proliferation of statehood in international law, the standard of civilization became entirely redundant. And there is a bunch of problems with this argument. And one relatively superficial but telling problem, is that if you go to the statute of the International Court of Justice, of the main judicial organ of the United Nations, in Article 38, it enumerates the sources the court can rely on to adjudicate cases. And this, for those who may not be familiar, this enumeration is also considered an authoritative statement of the sources of international law more broadly. And one of the sources is actually the general principles of law as found in the legal systems of civilized states. So there is an explicit reference to civilization. And I'm really interested in the way international lawyers treat this reference. And the more, again, if anything at all is said, the more common instruction is to read it out, to read Article 38 as if this reference to civilization does not exist. So the argument usually is, well, this is parochial. Today we accept that all states are civilized states. There's nothing to see there. There's nothing, this has no meaning. And I'm really interested in that because it sounds exceedingly defensive. I could tell you that, like, based on principles of treaty interpretation, that's a very unorthodox way of interpreting treaties, pretend that words are not there. So from a doctrinal perspective, is strange. But it is also strange because I'm really interested in reading as a scholarly practice in general, but also as a lawyerly practice in particular. I think that reading texts out loud to each other, for example, in the form of quotation, is a big part of the craft of being a scholar and of the craft of being a lawyer, including a practicing lawyer. And I find this instruction to misread symptomatic of a broader tension and a deeper tension in the discipline of international law. Of course, as you may imagine, and I'm talking, I imagine, to a mostly heterodox audience in whatever your discipline is, this majority opinion is not the only opinion. The last 20 years, there has been a true explosion of critical approaches to international law, including so-called third world approaches to international law that emphasize the centrality of imperialism in the forging of core concepts of international law, but of course also of international relations, such as sovereignty or statehood. So Tony Angie, in his path-breaking Imperialism, Sovereignty, and the Making of International Law, asserted very much the centrality of civilization for contemporary international law by claiming that civilization has been yet another expression of what he reads to be the dynamics of difference as the basic animating force behind international law. So this is a pretty standard post-colonial argument in international law that goes like this. What international law has been doing for Angie since already the 16th century is to create difference between Western and non-Western political communities and to constantly come up with rules, techniques, and practices that claim to be bridging this difference. This has been an extremely influential rereading of civilization for many, and I count myself within them. However, I also felt, and that's what I tried to do in this book, that this argument about the dynamics of difference left certain questions unanswered. And my main discomfort or desire to work further with the dynamics of difference was roughly the following. What I find less persuasive is that one could make an argument that goes like this. Every legal system, or most legal systems, both domestic and international, operate with forms of inclusion and exclusion, right? Most legal systems draw a boundary and they say, here is who is outside and here is what you need to do in order to be included, right? Some could say that this is a pretty, if not universal, at least widespread feature of legal systems. And my question becomes the following. What is the historical specificity of the standard of civilization and of international law as it emerged as a distinct discipline and practice in the last quarter of the 19th century? And I'm really happy to defend this periodization if anyone is a little bit uncomfortable with it. And many international lawyers are a little bit uncomfortable with it. So that is one of the questions I set out to answer. And in setting it out to answer, I came up with the following answer. Civilization is the historically distinct way through which international law reflects, without being able to resolve a very basic contradiction of global capitalism, which is its tendency to expand without limit, but at the same time expand without limit in a way that is fundamentally uneven. And I'm going to take it step by step and tell you how I got there. So first, to get there, I had to deal with a very obvious problem, which was this mainstream opinion that I described a minute ago, the idea that this is parochial, this is something that belongs to pre-1945 international legal order, has a certain obviousness to it. Like if you go to Google books and you Google civilization and its derivatives, including in French and in German, you will see that its appearance declines sharply. It doesn't decline sharply after 1945. It declines sharply, I think, after the 60s and the 70s. So it's decolonization more than the UN Charter. But it does decline sharply, right? And I think that poses a problem if we want to say that this is still a relevant standard. I do think it still is. And I think my way around it was the following. Civilization is not and has never been, both in international law, but I would also say in international politics, a unitary concept that ever lent itself to a definite and exact definition and a stable definition. Rather, it has always been a style or a form of arguing about the distribution of rights and duties under international law. And I think you could make it much broader. There is distribution of rights and duties in international relations more broadly. And if this is the case, that this is indeed a style of argument, then the decline of explicit usage is interesting in its own right. I think I know what happened there, but it's not definite. It doesn't tell you that this style of arguing became redundant or disappeared. If this is a style of argument, what style of argument is this? I'm saying that this is, in this book, I'm saying that this is a style of argument that is bifurcated and internally unstable, in the sense that it constantly oscillates between two distinct yet interrelated logics. On the one hand, I call it the logic of improvement, and on the other hand, we have what I call the logic of biology. The logic of improvement basically promises to non-Western, non-white majority, non-Christian majority political communities equal inclusion, conditional upon internal reform, upon embracing the laws, institutions, and even aesthetics of capitalist modernity. So things like, if I wanted to be a very old school Marxist, and that wouldn't be very far from the truth, I would tell you civilization at a very basic level, or at least the logic of improvement, is contract and property. If you don't have contracts and property, you're simply not civilized. So private law. In addition to that, things like legalization of social affairs and of international affairs internationally. Things like state centralization and bureaucratization of the state apparatus. So the argument is, if you do these things, you will get equal rights and duties under international law. And the poster child for the logic of improvement at the turn of the 20th century was Japan. Japan underwent, as you know, a rapid process of top-down modernization and also transition to the capitalist mode of production. And very, very quickly, for example, extraterritoriality, I can explain later what that was if it's not familiar to everyone, was abolished in 1899. And in fact, Japan joined other Western states in imposing unequal treaties to places like China or Korea. But at the same time as the logic of improvement, there has always been another logic at play. And this is the logic of biology, which constantly defers the promise of equal inclusion based on ideas of immutable difference. Basically, no matter how much you reform, no matter how much you try, somehow you always fall short. Somehow you will never reach fully civilized status. And these ideas of immutable difference historically have been expressed through different vocabularies. And surprisingly, the most common vocabulary has been the one of race, right? Open racialization of certain political communities and even of certain states. This is not the only one, though. At the same time, the language of sex, and I use sex as opposed to gender intentionally, so sex understood as stable, binary, and natural, has been used very extensively to anchor this logic of biology, right? So the idea that certain states are either too feminine or hyper masculine, and therefore we cannot possibly trust them with equal rights because it's either brutal black men or hysterical women. How can we possibly give them equal rights and duties? Or sometimes this logic of biology has found expression through the idiom of childhood, the idea that certain political communities have not yet, with the emphasis on yet, reached full intellectual, moral, and even physical maturity, and therefore their full inclusion in the international community is constantly postponed. So this is the bifurcation, right? Two logics. How about the internal instability? And this is where the argument gets quite deconstruction-y, because the argument says, well, as it happens with these dyads that Western thought loves so much, the more you start looking into the logic of improvement, the more it starts collapsing into the logic of biology and vice versa, right? These two poles, they construct each other, but in reality, they also collapse into each other. What appears to be the preconditions of capitalist modernity very often turn out to be the culturally specific manifestations of that political power assumed in Western Europe, or for example, in white settler colonies, and vice versa. Things that appear to be transparently about race, for example, chattel slavery, turns out to be linked to capitalist development. So the example that I give in the book for that is the very different ways in which slavery as a non-capitalist system was treated, let's say, in Africa when practiced by Ethiopia. And slavery was treated in Africa when practiced by colonial powers, or slavery that was practiced in the southern states of the United States. The second forms of slavery, forms that were racialized, but also forms that were incorporated within global circuits of capitalist production and reproduction, received a much more lenient treatment by international lawyers than, let's say, slavery as practiced in Ethiopia and as a non-capitalist or pre-capitalist mode of production. So these two logics, the more you start, poking them, the more they collapse into each other. But I think they collapse into each other also in another way, which is the question who decides, or if you're thinking in more lawyerly terms, the question of jurisdiction. The logic of improvement fundamentally contains within it, or slides very easily into the logic of biology, because what you have is certain actors, especially Western international lawyers and their respective states, asserting authority to unilaterally impose and assess criteria for inclusion in the international legal order, right? So what appears to be an open order, according to the logic of improvement, that anyone can get in, at the same time has inherent in it notions of hierarchy and exclusion. That is roughly the legal, or the very descriptive juridical argument that I'm making. There is a broader concern there, and this concern involves how does critique, or how can critique look in international law or in law in general? And for those of you who are not familiar with the debates, I'll just tell you very quickly that there has been a very long line of critical legal thinking in law and in international law in particular, that its main line of attack is based on the idea of legal indeterminacy, that in reality, law does not comprise of rules with a stable and concrete content. It is a language of arguing about, let's say, international affairs that can never ground authoritatively concrete solutions to legal problems, right? So the argument is that law is not rules. Law is a language, and it's a fundamentally indeterminate language, and judges or other legal officials are hiding their personal preferences about the outcome by invoking a supposed determinate nature of the law, whereas this is a trick. This is something they're saying to hide the politics behind international law. So this is the argument, roughly and very badly, about legal indeterminacy. Many Marxist and more broadly left legal theorists are somewhat uncomfortable with this argument. And this discomfort goes something like this. How can we say that law does things in the world? How can we say that law enables domination and exploitation if law is actually so indeterminate? And the argument there is that we are making law into a voluntaristic game that anyone basically can say whatever they want, and everyone has an equal chance in getting their politics actualized through the law. How this becomes basically you're shooting a moving target. And colleagues like B.S. Chimney, who is a Marxist Ntina Tzouvala, so third world approaches to international law, or Rose Parfit, who is a Marxist international lawyer in Kent, have actually made this argument, and they have reasserted a certain defense of law as relatively determinate rules. For example, in critique of Marty Koskiniemi, who is a typical example of this post-structuralist critique in law. My argument is that there is nothing wrong with legal indeterminacy as such, and it doesn't preclude critical engagements with law. The problem is the conclusions that a particular group of international lawyers, including Marty Koskiniemi, drew from them. So basically the conclusion was a certain reaffirmation of the charismatic authority of the individual lawyer. So the idea was law is indeterminate, and therefore when the international lawyer makes certain choices, he, and I'm using the pronouns very intentionally here, needs to be very aware of these choices, he needs to be reflexive about these choices, and he needs to take responsibility for the political consequences of these choices. And I'm not, I think there's something very valuable in that, but I think at the same time, it is an argument that is fundamentally individualistic. It assumes a certain charismatic authority for lawyers that I think it's a bad thing. I think it paralyzes politics. I'm happy to explain why I think that. And I think I think that is a conclusion that was drawn from indeterminacy, and it's not a necessary conclusion. And I think a second conclusion that was drawn from indeterminacy, again, goes back to the work of Marty Koskiniemi. And Marty Koskiniemi pretty much separated in his work two things: legal indeterminacy which is what I described above, and the international law's biases, political biases. So the argument for Koskiniemi goes something like this: bias lives in the institutions. Bias doesn't have to do primarily with the structure of the international legal argument, which is indeterminate after all. It's just that different international institutions have different politics, they have different rationales, and they will very predictably reach different conclusions. We're dealing even with the same body of law. So basically think about like a human rights crowd and an IMF crowd, or the human rights crowd and the World Trade Organization crowd, right? If you give them a question of patents and human rights, you can guess pretty well who is going to prioritize what, right? And who is going to privilege what in their legal reasoning, right? So Koskiniemi says bias lives in the institutions. My argument is legal indeterminacy is a good idea, and we shouldn't throw the baby of legal indeterminacy away with this bathwater of charismatic authority and the such. And my argument in this book goes as follows. What if, and this is where my argument is coming full circle to what I was saying earlier about the historical specificity of civilization. What if it is in the precise way in which international law is indeterminate that we can locate its biases, and in this instance, its pro-capitalist bias? And my argument goes like this. This flip-flopping I have described, this oscillation between improvement and biology, reflects in however mediated way a very basic contradiction of global capitalism as a system of production and circulation. And this is its tendency, as I was saying earlier, to both expand, both geographically, but also in matters of question of like the aspects of human life subject to commodity form and exchange. It expands without limit of border, homogenizing space, law, culture, all these things. But at the same time, this expansion is fundamentally uneven, and therefore it creates fragmentation, divergence, stratification, things like that. So very common Marxist developmental arguments about how what we experience as underdevelopment is not insufficient incorporation into capitalism, but rather subordinate incorporation into global capitalism. So, and each of these logics I have described reflects one of these two tendencies, right? Improvement is never-ending expansion. Biology is the unevenness of this expansion. And of course, international law, which at the end of the day is a discursive system, reflects this contradiction, but it cannot solve it. And hence the flip-flopping, right? Hence why there is this constant oscillation and the one logic collapse into each other, because the discursive system that is international law cannot provide a solution to this material contradiction that goes far beyond its contours. So this is basically the main arguments of the book. And I basically what I've summarized here is the introduction, which is a pretty substantive introduction. And after the introduction, there's 4 substantive chapters. So first, I start with the 19th century, especially late 19th century, and the so-called unequal treaties. And I'm especially interested in the arguments both Western and non-Western lawyers made in trying, when they were negotiating the abolition of unequal treaties. And for example, one of the things I'm really interested in is how in this process non-Western international lawyers incorporated the standard of civilization. So they started using themselves this language to conduct their international affairs. both to be obviously intelligible to their non-Western colleagues, but also because it served very well the projects of state building and capitalist accumulation, they were involved in. And it's also really interesting, for example, how they started using this language of civilization also domestically against their own domestic detractors. Second substantive chapter deals with the League of Nations and the emancipation of Iraq. So Iraq was the only state that became independent while the League was still in operation. And while this discussion played out within the League, basically the Permanent Mandates Commission, which was the organ overseeing, let's say, the colonial branch, the overtly colonial branch of the League of Nations, had a very detailed discussion about what preconditions needed to be met for Iraq or any other state to become independent under the mandate system. And what I'm arguing is, in the process, they repeated, but they also significantly reworked both the logic of improvement and the logic of biology. A significant difference in the logic of improvement in the interwar period is, for example, the impact logics of welfarism and state intervention started having upon the logic of improvement. So what it meant to be a civilized state in 1930 was not the same as being a civilized state in 1880, right? Some nominal, or you could say gestural, moves towards basic welfare or hygiene or education provision started being incorporated within the logic of improvement. And one of the things that I tried to do throughout the book is to show that the logic of improvement in biology are extant, but their precise content changes. It's not something that remains unchanged since 1880, because obviously the capitalist state has changed a bunch since 1880. Third, I'm using as an example the Southwest Africa saga in front of the International Court of Justice. For those of you not familiar, the question there concerned the ongoing colonial occupation and imposition of apartheid by apartheid South Africa on what we call now, what is now Namibia. And there was a series of challenges, especially by post-colonial states, to this status quo. And this series of challenges for contingent reasons were argued through the idiom of civilization. And what I'm trying to map there is what I think has been the most ambitious instance to date to use the standard of civilization against the grain. So, post-colonial states basically tried to say in front of the ICJ that the particular form of racial capitalism South Africa was implementing in Namibia was actually in violation of the standard of civilization. So everything that I have said now turned to its head. This argument actually backfired, went incredibly badly for a number of reasons that I'm happy to explain later. Some of these reasons were very historically contingent, but I think some of these reasons had to do with the structure of civilization as an argument. And finally, I have the more contemporary chapter that deals with two separate questions, legal questions pertaining to the war on terror, the occupation of Iraq and the neoliberal reforms promoted under that and their legality or not, and contemporary arguments about the usage of self-defense against states that are so-called unwilling or unable to stop terrorist attacks. And I try to show that even though the explicit language of civilization has all but disappeared, this basic argumentative structure that I have presented to you is still very much present. Thank you very much for your attention, and I really welcome your questions and comments.
Thanks so much, Ntina. We now have a good 45 minutes for question and answer. If you'd like to speak, please put an X in the chat box and I will call on you. Alternatively, you can leave your question or comment in writing in the chat box and I will read it out on your behalf. And if you could please briefly introduce yourselves. Justin.
Thank you. Justin Rosenberg. I teach international relations here at Sussex. Thank you for a fantastic presentation. That was so stimulating. I really enjoyed it, and it was so well delivered and really, really great. There was one thing, and I guess it's quite a central thing, that I still don't quite understand. You set out this bifurcation between language of improvement and language of biology, and you said that these eventually collapse into each other, or recurrently collapse into each other, as a result of uneven development. Can you just clarify, why does that lead the language of improvement to collapse into the language of biology, rather than simply saying there is a hierarchy of development? So there are societies that are, less developed than others, and therefore, or less civilized, if you like, and therefore have less legal standing. Why must it revert to a biological standard?
Shall I respond to this one, or shall I? Yeah,
Would you like to take another one, or you want to respond directly?
I think I'll respond to, I'm happy to go one by one for now, and then if they proliferate, we can bundle them up. So here's the thing. First, I need to clarify that when I say biology, it doesn't always present itself as 19th century biological racism, right? Sometimes, and especially in the 1990s, it was through the idiom of culture that this immutable difference played out, right? So others have made this criticism, and I take it on board, that the logic of biology is more accurately the logic of immutable difference. I think that would make it slightly more accurate representation of what I'm saying. But I do think that even with this correction, the argument stands in the sense that I think what is happening here is, on the one hand, the logic of improvement always wants to leave the door open for equal inclusion, right? Because otherwise, how am I going to incentivize you to do all these reforms if I'm not giving you the carrot that at some point this will be open to everyone, right? And this partly has to do also with the distinctly liberal influences upon international law that finds it extremely difficult to say this hierarchy is permanent and never ending, right? It has to have, if it is to exist as a minimally liberal project, it has to have a certain possibility of openness and reform. Otherwise, this thing, the machine of constant reform will stop working. And I think the collapse happens for a number, the collapse back to biology happens for a number of reasons. One reason is, of course, that because the hierarchy and the uneven development remains, this somehow needs to be juridified through, if not formally, de facto unequal legal rights, right? This unequal development will somehow, if not through official civilizational ranking, wash out in international law, right? Because if, for example, I want to keep extracting from a particular place labor or resources, I need to create a juridical cascade for that. And having this constant sliding back to biology helps. Another way this sliding back tends to happen is when the control of Western states or Western international lawyers over the modalities and pace of inclusion is challenged. So, for example, by non-Western international lawyers asserting that they can unilaterally assess themselves whether their political communities are now civilized, this authority to unilaterally impose rules is challenged and needs to be reasserted, and it tends to be reasserted towards through the logic of biology. There is a third way of answering your question, which is, do I think that the articulation of the logic of biology is necessary to uneven development, or could it have been expressed theoretically through another way? And the answer to that is no. I think it's contingent. I think it happened in the late 19th century, because in the late 19th century, it was really fashionable to put things into categories. And once you start putting things into categories, you might as well put humans as well, right? It's just a machine. You can absolutely imagine a non-existing capitalism in which capitalist development took off first in Shanghai, which in the 18th century, there wasn't a fully unlikely scenario in which unequal development would have come to be juridified in international law through a different system. That is, I'm saying that the moment this came together contingently, it started producing its own necessities, right? People just started arguing this way because it felt intuitively correct, because international lawyers, as all disciplines, we inherit patterns of arguments from our forefathers and our foremothers, and things get entrenched. But if I understand your question correctly, I'm not arguing that this was some sort of an automatic obviousness. It was a contingent coming together that had to do with the way folks were arguing in Western Europe in the last quarter of the 19th century. But it became subsequently entrenched, both materially and within the discursive structures of international law. Did I answer your question? Thank you.
Ben.
Thanks very much. That was a really fantastic presentation. Very, very stimulating and very useful for me, certainly. Because I'm thinking. So I'm Ben Selwyn, and I teach about international development. And I'm thinking quite a lot these days about Rostow, that horrible state terrorist, which unbelievably people don't call him that. They just say, oh, he was a theorist of the stages of development. He supported and argued for the escalation of the Vietnam War and the mass murder of, I don't know, millions of people, but that's okay because he's a theorist of development. So I've been thinking about him, and just listening to your talk, I think it captures really well what he was up to. His modernization theory was the modernization of the white man's burden into acceptable language of inclusion and difference, as you've put it. The inclusion is like you can all go through the stages and become developed, and the difference is, well, we're advanced and you're backward, basically. And they were using that language at the time, or you're traditional, and we'll help you. So I just said that just to give you some background. I wonder if you've considered him in your book, if you've got anything to say about him and modernization theory and how that fits. But then this fits to the kind of my kind of question. I mean, that's the leading question, but this is a more substantial question, I guess. You say you combine Marxism and deconstructive analysis or deconstruction analysis. So, Marxists are really into the ideas of class struggle and anti-imperialism. And I'm just thinking, where do you see because what I really like about your talk, one of the things I really like is you show how this inclusion difference changes over time. It's not immutable, right? I think that's really important. And so, a kind of knee-jerk Marxist would say, oh, well, comrade, the most important things for understanding these things are class struggle and imperialism. And I think that would make quite a big, if you just put that out there, that does make quite a big difference. I mean, so the big struggles of the Vietnamese against the French and the Americans made a big difference in changing thinking about development. So I suppose my more substantive question is, do you have a kind of some worked out kind of framework where you say the things that push this forward or the key drivers of this are X, Y, and Z? Thanks.
These are fantastic questions. Thank you so much, Ben. So I'll start from the second, I'll go back to Rostow. My answer to that is the following. The mix between improvement and biology, the exact proportion where the chips will fall between the two, makes a huge difference in people's everyday life, right? It's the difference between living under like apartheid and living under, for example, racial capitalism that doesn't have formal apartheid rules, right? These things make a huge difference. In struggles, including class struggles, but also much broader struggles in international law, including decolonization struggles, but even struggles between different ruling classes, as I was saying earlier, international lawyers in the periphery, pushing back, has made a big difference in what is the mix between the two. And I do not consider this to be something to look down, right? I don't frown upon this, because in people's everyday lives, this makes a huge difference, how much logic of biology you get. If you get too much, it's called genocide, right? That's where it gets. And it's better to live under situations of non-genocide than living under situations of genocide. So that is, and struggle is everywhere. And I don't foreground it in my analysis, partly because, and we can have this discussion, I don't think that the distinct contribution of Marxism in social theory is the idea of class or class struggle. I think a lot of 19th and early 20th century socialists and anyone to the left of center thought a lot about class, right? Marxism has become the repository of class because everybody gave up on it in the 1990s. But I don't think it's its distinct contribution to social theory. So I'm interested in it in my everyday life because I think it has an effect on me in my everyday life. But I think in my book, it wasn't at the forefront, even though I think things like, for example, the transformation of what was the ideal state in the logic of improvement incorporates outcomes of class struggle, right? The even limited rise of welfarism reflected very real struggles of people, both in the North, but also in the global South, right? And it was a way partly of domesticating them. So it incorporated as much as it domesticated at the same time. That's the good news. The bad news is the following. My argument is that as long as you're arguing within civilization, the confines of the argumentative moves and political positions available are extremely narrow. And my argument is that even when these folks try to do it at the peak of decolonization and at the peak of like international power and international solidarity of post-colonial states in the Southwest Africa saga, it went tremendously badly. So my argument, and I can explain why if that's not familiar to everyone. So my argument is, without making any argument about popular movements using international law as a whole, I'm agnostic about that. I am not agnostic about using the standard of civilization for progressive ends. And I think it's a terrible idea. And it tends to backfire because that's my whole thing. This thing goes back and forth. So the argument there is, I think the standard of civilization is a terrain of struggle, but I think it's a structurally incredibly constrained terrain of struggle that I'm not sure all other things in international law are so incredibly constrained. So this is the answer about a struggle. And that then there is also a huge degree of contingency, right? My argument doesn't explain why this or that case was decided in this or that way. What it does explain is the structural limitations within which the case was argued to begin with. And within that, there is a number of conjectural factors that explain it. Rostow, I don't deal with him and I don't deal with development much, partly because there is excellent work in international law that deals with development. Sandhya Bahuja's Decolonizing International Law is an example that makes a very similar move about how civilized, uncivilized became developed, underdeveloped. But I think that Rostow is an excellent example, because I'm teaching gender law and development class here in Canberra. And what I love about Rosto is he explicitly says that, stages of economic growth means to be further away from nature, right? Mastery over nature is development. And if you're underdeveloped, it means you're too close to nature, right? I think he makes this logic of biology, not just in terms of using cranky language that we don't use anymore, like savage or whatever, but also his sheer conceptualization of it contains both the improvement and the biology. So I think it goes much deeper than using, politically incorrect language. And I think especially the way Rosto treats nature, and to be underdeveloped is to be of nature. And in my gender law and development, it's like also it's to be a woman, right? So these chains of equivalence are pretty easy to make there. I think he's an exemplar case of the explicitness of the linking of the two and of the instability of the two. So I haven't made this argument, but I think, yeah, absolutely. At least that's how I teach him to my poor students. Thank you.
We have a question from Adria. Adria, you're still muted.
Right, can you hear me now? All right, thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Adrià Reyes. I'm a PhD candidate in Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. It was, as I said, very, very interesting presentation. It's not kind of my specialty, but I was wondering whether how do the discourse on failed states might be a antiquated way to name that, but sometimes I was wondering whether the discourse on civilization and on inclusion and difference of some peoples or some states might fit into the whole issue with failed states. And as a side question, whether you have thought on whether the whole narrative of the responsibility to protect might kind of fit or not fit into that discourse or narrative. Yeah, thank you.
That's a great question. I mean, yeah, as you said, this is all a very 90s discussion, but I think 90s was a great moment, for what I'm going to say, not generally. It was a great moment for repackaging both improvement and biology. There was a fundamental repackaging of all these things that happened in the 90s through things like failed state or through the idiom of culture, especially, right? It wasn't, it's not that they're biologically inferior, it's just their culture is biologically, is inferior, right? Yes, same thing, same difference. So I think that the discourse of this failed state was, in my view, a pretty straightforward reproduction of this. And one thing that I do in the final chapter about Iraq is to go about showing how US lawyers, both, and British secondarily, both government lawyers and academic lawyers in this weird category in the US that is like kind of both, and you never know how they're writing what. They had been writing long before, or a couple of years before the invasion of Iraq, on why normal laws of occupation that, for example, prevent the occupying power from changing the laws too much did not apply to Iraq. Why? Because Iraq was basically, sometimes they used the moniker failed state, sometimes they didn't. My favorite story from that is John Woo, known from the torture memos, saying that the laws of occupation should not apply to Iraq because Saddam Hussein is torturing people. And like sometimes people cannot stop telling on themselves, right? That's John Wall, the man who authorized torture in Guantanamo. And that was the argument he thought and the argument was we can instigate all sorts of reforms, especially economic reforms. And it was basically the most aggressive neoliberalization ever recorded in history, right? Even like shock doctrine in Russia is a walk in the park in comparison to what happened in Iraq between 2003 and 2004. And this was all authorized or attempted to be authorized through this idea of failed state. And the argument was that for Iraq to be rehabilitated as a state, it needs to be improved. And improvement has come to mean a very narrow version, not just of capitalist state, but of aggressively neoliberal capitalist state. But of course, Iraq will never be improved enough. And there's all these writings, for example, from officials within the administration, especially when things start going south, that is like, oh, you know, Iraqis don't know about freedom, or the reforms are failing because these people are duplicitous and they're lying to us and they're not doing what they're telling me. Like Edward Said pretty much just transferred to Iraq straightforwardly. So I would say the discourse of this failed state, both again by using the moniker of the failed state and by not using it but describing it, was almost the principal means through which improvement in biology were articulated between 1990 and let's say 2011. So Libya is the end of that high moment of that. To go back to responsibility to protect, I think the interesting bit of responsibility to protect that fits really well within this conundrum is the bit that has passed, that has presented itself as the nice bit of going in and building hospitals, which is the third pillar, right? The responsibility to rebuild. The responsibility to rebuild generally has not been about building hospitals. It has been about privatizing them. And I think there has been a lot of emphasis of what responsibility to protect does in regards to authorizing force, in which my doctrinal lawyerly answer would be, at the end of the day, that it hasn't done that much. But I think it has done a lot in giving legal words and a humanitarian spin to a bunch of processes of post-conflict neoliberal reform that had been happening basically after Yugoslavia, that then got packaged, this version of the logic of improvement and the logic of biology in a way, got packaged under the third pillar, which is meant to be the nice stuff. But I think it's not the nice stuff.
Thank you. Faiz.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Ntina. Thank you very much again for this wonderful talk and these great ideas around civilization and how it's used. But I'm, I guess, still maybe struggling to understand how the two logics blend into each other. And there is a moment in your talk and in your book where you talk about this moment in the 19th century when the Ottoman Empire and Japan were partially admitted into the club, the civilized club. And I wonder, that would be particularly interesting for me to, if you could sort of flesh out that story, but inserting your interpretation, like how the logics played out in the admission or not of one or both of those powers. That'd be, I'd really appreciate that. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. No, that's a great question. So, for example, just I will give you a narrow example from Japan or Ottoman Empire or whatever in these processes of partial inclusion. So, here comes the logic of improvement, right? And it says to Japan, you need to have a family law code, and you have to have a criminal law system that is based on individual responsibility, not these collective responsibility systems that kinship societies might work on. Or it says to, especially to the Ottoman Empire, you need to have a secular non-Muslim legal system. Or it says to Siam similar things about how to organize law. Most of these demands were not always accompanied by some sort of rigorous comparative work or deep knowledge of the legal system of any of these places. So we start from improvement, right? We are squarely within improvement. You need a civil law code. You need personal law changes. Here's how it collapses. It collapses very quickly by being, none of these people knew how the Western lawyers really had a good knowledge of how these legal systems were actually working, right? Most of these evaluations were through insinuation and associations like, of course, their legal system does not protect property because it's a Muslim legal system. Or, of course, these people's prisons are extremely brutal and there is a lot of torture going on. True, some of it, right? Obviously true, some of it. But was there necessarily more torture than there was in Britain or in British colonies in Africa? Probably not. So much of it did not happen, for example, through some sort of like a robust comparative law exercise that went in and said, capitalist accumulation cannot work in this place because patent law is not exactly how it should be. Much of it happens through insinuation and through equations of being non-white with having a dysfunctional state, regardless of how your state actually works, right? It didn't come up. Or the reforms were never enough. You did what they told you, but there was always something else you then had to do on top. So this deferral until basically either non-Western states got enough power to be able to say, well, no, or something changed very fundamentally in international relations. So, for example, they abolished extraterritoriality in China in the midst of World War II, partly as a sign of goodwill from Western powers because China is fighting Japan, right? And you have to give them something. So, but this logic of kicking the can down the road and that no amount of reform is enough. And also, I will judge if you have reformed enough. And that it's a logic of biology inherent in the logic of improvement, because by asserting my right, I don't set rules for you because we're equal legal subjects. If I start saying that I do set laws for you, I'm already arguing we are not equal legal subjects, right? So in my mind, also the question of legal judgment and who had jurisdiction to authoritatively set the preconditions for improvement already has in it the idea of biology. And of course, there is the flip side, right, which is non-Western international lawyers, Chinese international lawyers, Japanese international lawyers saying, no, we will judge. We are judging it. We are accepting the logic of improvement, partly because we are very happy with state centralization and capitalist accumulation, but we will judge when we have reached it. And we now assert that we have reached it. Some of these arguments flew, some of these arguments didn't. But to me, this signaled the intention of non-Western international lawyers to limit the role of biology within the argument, or at least to make sure they were not in the receiving end, because Japan was very eager to limit it in relationship to the West, was not at all eager to limit it in relationship to Korea or China, right? But at least to the extent that they were in the receiving end, they did challenge, and they did challenge the logic of constantly kicking the can down the road. So I don't know, did I give you a sense of how I think they collapse into each other? Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you very much, Melanie. And hi, Dina. It's absolutely lovely to finally get to meet you, even in this forum. And I apologise for having had my camera off, but I've got my lippy on and I'm here now. So thank you so much for that wonderful talk. It's been lovely to hear about what you've been working on. I'm not sure if this is a question or just some thoughts, but I want to ask you, in my capacity as a lawyer who works on human rights and critical theory, about some of those words, right? So what you understand by critique and what space you see for rights as offering a sort of site and space of contestation within this kind of collapse of the logic of improvement sliding into the logic of biology. I mean, listening to you, I was thinking quite a lot about Jasbir Puar's work on the right to maim and the way she talks about R2M and the logics of debilitation, you know, where sort of the state is able to exercise this right to maim such that it creates debility rather than death. Okay, and I was thinking about this as you were talking, you know, debility is something as a kind of supreme site of state abandonment, right? So it doesn't have to be about death, right? And within that, I guess in my own thinking, I'd like to ask you, do you see a space for rights in being able to contest that, right? So when the logic of improvement, because this is the thing I find insidious, right? And it was in your little blurb even, that the logic of improvement relies on this promise, this expectation, or a word like that, of rights. Yes. However, you know, I would argue, and Puar argues, that this is a kind of insidious, distracting argument. Yes, because the right to maim trumps everything else, and we can see it in sites of protest today. Yes. So in some of these post-colonial states that you're talking about, I mean, something very much on my mind at the moment, because I'm writing on it at the moment, the farmers' protest, or the farmers' movement even, where I think critique, or our critical contribution, needs to look beyond rights, or what I would call after rights, okay, and maybe even beyond law, right? So you've used that word a lot today as well, and I wonder perhaps whether we need to go maybe not just beyond after rights, but beyond law, to something that, you know, thinks about ethics, thinks about relationality, thinks about spirituality even, right? And those are things that don't fit into an answer to your question posed in the way you asked it. How can critique look in international law or law? I feel like that was a bit rambling, so I hope you got something from that.
I absolutely did. It's lovely to meet you too, finally. So here's my answer. I can't pull up the quote now, but there is a beautiful quote, and it's opening that chapter of the book by SWAPO, which is the national liberation, what was the national liberation movement of Southwest Africa, now Namibia. And they're talking about the cases in front of the ICJ. And they say something like, well, these cases, if nothing else, like probably have distracted our attention of what was actually going on in Namibia and what really decided the fate of the national liberation movement. And they say something like, and our right to self-determination has nothing to do with the niceties of international law. We don't anchor, I'm translating now, that's international law, full stop, and now it's my voice, which is, we don't anchor our desires and our political imagination and our political project to international law, right? This thing happened for very historically contingent reasons. We don't really care about it, and we actually think it was a problem. And this quote has really stayed with me. I think it's really explosive of this discussion of of the whole, especially the idea we have a right to self-determination. We don't care what international law thinks about that. So that is my partial answer to this. The other thing that I came to think about when I was writing this book is that I care less about monikers like human rights, and I care more about the sort of arguments that they summarize, right? Because that's the whole thing that I'm trying to do with this. And in a sense of, people do ask me about human rights a lot about this book, and I'm like, well, I think you can argue human rights in a way that is very civilizationally, and I think also you can argue it in ways that are not, in ways that don't ask subjects to normalize themselves in order to be the bearers of these rights. I don't think that these arguments are always the arguments that have been successfully put forward in front of courts. I think, for example, the way a lot of thinking about normalization, like LGBT rights, have been put forward is a normalizing process. But I think these arguments, the non-normalizing ones, never disappear, right? And I think your own work will be able to talk to that much more than mine. But in a sense, I've become much more attuned to the way people go about arguing stuff, rather than which field of international law or domestic law this argument gets categorized into. I've become, in a sense, I became much more open to human rights arguments because of this book. I was like, it may be possible if people resist this allure of civilization, it may be possible to articulate arguments like that. At the same time, and I could not agree with you more, I think like the law, any law in any structure of argument, being the horizon of your struggle or of your existence is suicidal, right? That's truly a very bad idea. But partially, I'm trying to take seriously the idea that, you know, for 8 hours a day or whatever, I work as a lawyer. So this is a question I try to figure out. But yeah, absolutely having in mind that thinking that this is the horizon of our political and human coexistence is a terribly, terribly bad idea. I hope I did answer part of your question.
Louise.
Hello. Thank you so much for the talk. It was wonderful. I have just a very quick question, or maybe a couple of questions. And you kind of alluded to this at the end of your presentation, and I would just love to, if you could be very interested, if you could say a little bit more about it. You talked a little bit about the new guises of civilization. So I'd just be interested to hear you say a bit about kind of the new emerging sites or discursive realms that you are kind of seeing this emerge kind of in a more contemporary kind of context. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll talk about the bit I talk in the book, which is, as I said earlier, Iraq, but the really, really contemporary one is, so a bunch of US, UK, and Australian international lawyers, and others, but mostly those, are making an argument that goes like this. If there is, or is going to be, or might have been in the past, a non-state actor / terrorist attack emanating from a state that does not control these non-state actors, so it's not like directing them, right, but is unwilling or unable to stop them, then we, US, UK, Australia, can use force against that state, even if it's not responsible for the acts of non-state actors, right? Because the traditional idea is you can only use force if the state controls the non-state actors. That was basically the orthodox opinion at the end of the Cold War. And basically, if you start opening this thing a little bit, what the demand, there's two things, again, improvement in biology. Who is unwilling or unable? Is there at any point some sort of robust evaluation of any of that? No, unwilling or unable is wink, wink. The people we know are unwilling or unable, right? So this is an argument that has been used against Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, basically, predominantly these three, to an extent Somalia, and so on and so forth. Because one could say, at the peak of the Syrian civil war, the country that had the most fighters that left to go and fight in Syria was Belgium. Was Belgium unwilling or unable, and Syria could actually start bombing downtown Brussels to stop them? No one ever made this argument with a straight face. So logic of biology, and you see it happening sometimes very, very explicitly with things like tens of phrases, and we all know which states are weak. Or examples, theoretical examples given are always very explicitly non-liberal democracies that are unwilling or unable. At the same time, and here comes the big bucks, there's always a demand that if you sign up to counter-terrorism policies, especially the kind of counter-terrorism policies promoted by the United States, if you change your budget in a way that shows you're buying stuff and participating in the war on terror, if you reform your army and the police in the way especially the US considers to be conducive to counterterrorism, and if you sign up to train and equip programs run by the State Department, you are willing, if not necessarily able. So there is a very explicit, so that was the argument, and there's a geopolitical dimension there, but the US would say when Russia tried to pull this argument against Georgia, the US argument was like, oh, no, Russia is not unwilling or unable because they're doing a train and equip program with us. Right? They cannot possibly be unwilling or unable. Or they have changed their budget to prioritize counterterrorism. So I feel that, and I'm really interested in things like use of force because we don't think about them very often in law. Other disciplines, and IR is much better than that. We don't think them very often in terms of political economy and state transformation. But I think in the unwilling or unable doctrine in the use of force is like as explicit as anything can be without really being explicit. So that could be, for example, one of these examples. The other obvious example that was almost so obvious that I didn't want to do it is things like structural adjustment programs, right? That always have this tango between you need to reform, but you can never reform enough, and your reform cannot be endogenous. It always needs to be supervised from the outside because you're kind of lazy and also a little bit thieves. And that comes, I'm Greek, so like I saw that happening kind of real time, and it wasn't insanely fun. So yeah, I mean, you can make this argument in investment law, but I'm really interested in the ways it plays out in fields that the political economy folks are not looking.
Thank you. We have one more question in the chat box, and I'm going to read it out by Zauran Lin. Thank you, Dina, for your presentation, and also congratulations on your recent piece on international responsibility with Rob Knox. It's fascinating, as is your monograph. This is Zauran Lin, a PhD student of public international law from China. My research project now is to critically engage with the history and discourse of historic title in international law, especially in territorial acquisitions. My question is rather an abstract one, and it starts with a quote. The problem is, however, how to change the world, end quote. Okay, famous quote. What may be the future path of Marxist approaches to international law to critique till the end, or to finally construct something, especially with so many discrepancies and disagreement in this trend as to what is to achieve? Thank you.
Thank you. That is a great question. So here's my answer to that. I don't think you can do politics without a constituency. And I think not only Marxists, generally radicals in international law ran out of constituency a while ago, right? Like, as in, I can construct whatever I want in my head if I cannot have an alliance of states in international law, and that's the tricky bit, to push it forward. It's just some ideas in my head, right? So I think like it is important to reflect on the ways in which the progressive alliances that existed in international law between 1960, 1955, let's say, 1960 to 1980 collapsed and nothing replaced them in international law, right? You could still say, you know, you can work with social movements, right? And I'm a little bit involved with the work the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food does, which is a take on the right to food that is much less individual based, much more collective based. It is much less state based, or much more individual provision based, much more collective control over the way we produce food based, and so on and so forth. So there is people who are doing, especially in the practical work, things like that. And I think these are valuable reconstructions. I think at the same time, it is important, especially if anyone has any whiff of materialism in their analysis, to admit that these reconstructive efforts remain relatively marginal, and remain relatively marginal because I don't think I can reconstruct international law, even if I come up with really good ideas, right? I think there was at some point a constituency. It collapsed in a really ugly way. And until there is another one, I think we can do our best, and we can do work like that, especially with social movements, or especially what Bal was saying earlier with, let's say, the farmers movement in India. And there are movements that are using international law both to promote their interests, but also in ways that are creative and reconstructive. And I think when these things happen, we have to be there, and we have to be really attuned to when it's happening, and to the fact that, of course, it will happen with compromises and with getting your hands dirty. But at the same time, I cannot see how one may be within a minimally materialist framework and not acknowledge the historic defeat that post-colonialism suffered at the end of the 1970s, and it hasn't recovered, or a new movement that will take a similar and hopefully better agenda forward has not emerged, and that progressive international lawyers need to, not only Marxist, everyone needs to work within these limitations.
Thank you, Dina. We're now at the end of our Q&A. I want to thank Dr. Tzouvala for such an engaging lecture, and congratulations again on this book that won an honorable mention in our annual book award, and that, as we can see, already finds a really enthusiastic audience in international relations for people working on issues of imperialism and sovereignty, capitalism, liberal world order, and so forth. So I'd just like to make a quick announcement for our next event here at the Center for Advanced International Theory, and that's on the 27th of October. We are hosting our visiting fellow, Professor Randolph Persaud from the American University, and his talk is titled "Are Theorists as Civil Servants? Considerations in the Theory Policy Nexus in IR." You'll find a copy of our program on our website, and of course, you can follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a lovely rest of your day or of your night, Dina, in Australia. Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much, everyone.